Hi there, welcome to Jayville Stories. Please subscribe to my channel and turn on the post notifications to get updated when interesting stories are uploaded. Thank you. The early morning sun struggled to break through the thick mist that blanketed the small rural cemetery. The air was heavy, silent except for the rustling of leaves and the distant crowing of a rooster. At the far end of the cemetery, Grace, a slender young woman dressed in a faded black gown, knelt before two weathered wooden crosses. Her trembling hands clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers, purple hibiscus and white lilies she had carefully picked from the roadside. The graves, marked only by simple names and dates carved into the wood, belonged to her parents who had died in a car accident just a year ago. Tears streamed down Grace's face as she stared at the ground, her lips moving in whispered prayer. Her voice was barely audible, but it carried the weight of her sorrow. She felt a deep gnawing emptiness, a void no amount of tears or prayers could fill. This was her ritual, a daily visit to the graves to pour out her grief. It was the only place where she felt close to them, even if it was only a patch of dirt and two crosses. The scent of damp earth filled her nose as she gently placed the flowers at the base of the graves. Her fingers lingered on the soil, tracing invisible patterns as if she could somehow reach them, connect with them, even in death. "Mama, Papa," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I don't know what to do anymore. I feel so alone." Grace's mind drifted back to the life they once had. Her father, a cheerful farmer with a booming laugh, had been the heart of their family. Her mother, kind and gentle, had always found a way to make their modest home feel warm and inviting. Now the house was cold, stripped of the love that once made it a home. Her memories were all she had left, and even those felt fragile, like they might shatter if she clung to them too tightly. Her grief was interrupted by the sound of distant voices, children playing on the other side of the village. She wiped her tears quickly, afraid someone might see her. The village was small, and everyone knew everyone else's business. She didn't want their pity, nor did she want their whispers about the poor orphan girl. Grace stood slowly, brushing dirt from her knees. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to stand tall. She glanced back at the graves one last time, her heart heavy with the knowledge that she couldn't linger forever. As much as she wanted to stay, reality demanded her attention. She still had to return to the house she shared with her aunt Ngozi, who had taken her in begrudgingly after her parents' death. Life with Aunt Ngozi was a different kind of hardship. The older woman had made it clear from the start that Grace's presence was an inconvenience. She was constantly reminded of the burden she had become. "You're lucky I even took you in," Aunt Ngozi often said, her voice sharp. "I already have enough problems without adding you to the list." These words echoed in Grace's mind as she made her way back to the house, her feet dragging against the dusty path. Each step felt heavier than the last. She dreaded the cold, unwelcoming walls of her aunt's home, the sharp reprimands, and the endless reminders of her dependency. As she reached the edge of the village, Grace paused and looked over her shoulder toward the cemetery. The crosses were barely visible now, swallowed by the fog. She sighed deeply, her heart aching with the knowledge that she had no one left to turn to. But even as despair threatened to consume her, a flicker of hope lingered in the back of her mind, a desperate wish that life could change, that somewhere beyond this small village, a better future awaited her. With that thought, Grace wiped the tears from her face and squared her shoulders. She knew she couldn't stay here forever. Something had to change, and if no one would change it for her, she would have to find the strength to change it herself. Grace stepped through the creaking wooden gate of Aunt Ngozi's compound, her heart sinking at the sight of the small weathered house. The walls were cracked, and the once vibrant blue paint had faded to a dull gray. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wood and kerosene. The chickens clucked noisily in their coop, a stark contrast to the oppressive silence that usually filled the house. As she pushed open the front door, she was met by the sharp voice of Aunt Ngozi. "Where have you been, Grace? Do you think food will cook itself?" The older woman stood in the corner of the room, her hands on her hips, glaring at Grace with a mix of irritation and exhaustion. "I went to see Mama and Papa," Grace said softly, her head bowed. Ngozi let out a frustrated sigh and waved her hand dismissively. Always those graves. You spend more time there than you do helping around this house. Do you think I don't have enough work to do? You're not a child anymore, Grace. It's time to start pulling your weight. Grace bit her lip to keep from responding. She had long since learned that arguing with Aunt Ngozi was pointless. Instead, she walked past her to the tiny kitchen, where a pile of dirty dishes waited in the sink. She filled a basin with water and began scrubbing, her hands moving mechanically. Ngozi's words stung, but they were nothing new. Since her parents' death, Grace had endured her aunt's constant reminders of how much of a burden she had become. Each cutting remark felt like a weight added to the invisible load she carried on her shoulders. As Grace worked, she overheard her aunt muttering to herself, "I can't keep doing this, feeding another mouth, paying for her needs. She'll have to find somewhere else to go. Maybe Daniel can take her." Grace froze. Daniel, Uncle Daniel, her mother's younger brother. She hadn't seen him since she was a child, but she remembered the stories her parents told about him. A man full of potential who had moved to Lagos in search of a better life. But those stories had faded into whispers of disappointment over the years. "He drinks too much," the villagers said, a shadow of the man he used to be. Still, the idea of leaving the village sparked something in Grace. She rinsed the last dish and dried her hands, her mind racing. Perhaps Lagos would offer her the fresh start she desperately needed. Perhaps Uncle Daniel would be kinder, more understanding than Aunt Ngozi. That evening, as they sat in silence over a sparse dinner of yam and soup, Grace gathered her courage. "Auntie," she began hesitantly, "if Uncle Daniel can take me in, I would like to go." Ngozi looked at her sharply, her spoon pausing mid-air. For a moment, Grace thought she might refuse. But then the older woman sighed and set her spoon down. "Fine, I'll write to him tomorrow." "But don't think it'll be easy, Grace. Lagos isn't a place for lazy girls." Grace nodded, relief washing over her. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress in the corner of the room, she stared up at the dark ceiling and whispered a silent prayer. She didn't know what awaited her in Lagos, but she clung to the hope that it would be better than the life she was leaving behind. The following week passed in a blur of anxious anticipation. Grace tried to stay busy helping Aunt Ngozi around the house, though every task felt heavier with the knowledge that her life was about to change. Ngozi had sent the letter to Uncle Daniel through a local driver who made frequent trips to Lagos. Now all they could do was wait for his response. One humid afternoon, as Grace swept the dusty courtyard, a faint rumble of an engine broke the usual quiet of the village. She paused, her heart skipping a beat as the sound grew louder. Moments later, an old battered sedan sputtered into the compound, coughing out a cloud of smoke before coming to an abrupt stop. The car door creaked open and Uncle Daniel emerged. He was a tall man, but his slouched posture and weary expression made him seem smaller. His once handsome features were overshadowed by a scruffy beard and bloodshot eyes. A cigarette dangled from the corner of his mouth as he adjusted his faded cap. "Daniel," Aunt Ngozi greeted him curtly, stepping out from the house with her arms crossed. Her tone carried a mix of relief and irritation. "It's about time you showed up. I wasn't sure you'd come." Daniel waved her off dismissively, leaning against the car with a tired sigh. "I came, didn't I? Let's not make a big deal out of it." Grace stepped forward hesitantly, her eyes darting between her aunt and her uncle. Daniel noticed her and gave a half-hearted smile. "You've grown, Grace," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "Last time I saw you, you were barely up to my knees." "Good afternoon, Uncle," Grace said softly, bowing her head out of respect. He nodded and turned back to Ngozi. "So what's this about her coming with me?" "You know my situation isn't exactly stable," Ngozi snorted. "Stable or not, she can't stay here. I've done my part since her parents passed, but I have my own children to think about." "You're her uncle, Daniel. It's your turn to step up." Daniel sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. He looked at Grace again, his expression unreadable. "Fine," he said at last. "She can come with me, but don't expect miracles." Grace felt a flicker of relief mixed with nervousness. She had no idea what life with Uncle Daniel in Lagos would be like, but it couldn't be worse than the cold indifference she faced here. The journey to Lagos began early the next morning. Grace sat quietly in the passenger seat, clutching a small bag containing all her belongings. The car rattled and shook as they drove along the dusty village roads, the silence between them broken only by the occasional puff of Daniel's cigarette or the crackle of the car radio. As they left the village behind, the landscape began to change. The endless fields and mud huts gave way to paved roads and clusters of buildings. By the time they reached the outskirts of Lagos, Grace was overwhelmed by the sheer size and noise of the city. Cars honked aggressively, people crowded the streets, and the air was thick with the smell of fuel and fried food. "We're here," Daniel said as he turned into a narrow street lined with old apartment buildings. The walls were cracked and laundry hung from every balcony. Daniel parked the car in front of a weathered building and gestured for Grace to follow. His apartment was small and cluttered, with worn furniture and an ashtray overflowing with cigarette butts. "It's not much," Daniel admitted as he unlocked the door. "But it's home." Grace stepped inside, taking in her new surroundings. The room smelled faintly of alcohol and stale smoke, and the kitchen sink was piled with dirty dishes. Still, she felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't perfect, but it was a fresh start. "You can sleep on the couch," Daniel said, tossing his keys onto a table. "We'll figure out what to do tomorrow." Grace nodded, setting her bag down carefully. As she sat on the edge of the couch, she couldn't help but wonder what tomorrow would bring. The city felt vast and intimidating, but it also held the promise of opportunity. She silently vowed to make the most of it, no matter how hard it might be. For the first time in a long while, Grace allowed herself to dream of a better future. The next morning, the sun filtered weakly through the grimy window of Daniel's apartment, casting long shadows across the cluttered room. Grace sat on the edge of the couch, her hands folded in her lap, as she watched her uncle shuffle around the kitchen, making a pot of instant coffee. The air was heavy with the stale smell of cigarettes and the faint aroma of cheap coffee. "You'll need a job," Daniel said gruffly, his voice breaking the silence. He leaned against the counter, sipping his coffee and looking at her with a mix of expectation and uncertainty. "Lagos isn't cheap, and I can't afford to take care of both of us." Grace nodded, her stomach twisting with nervous anticipation. She hadn't expected a warm welcome, but the reality of her situation was beginning to sink in. She was on her own in a city she didn't understand, with an uncle who was more distant than she'd hoped. By mid-morning, Daniel had made a few calls and arranged for Grace to meet his employer, Mr. Emeka, who owned a small logistics company and lived in a large house in Surulere. Daniel's relationship with Emeka was complicated. He worked as a driver for the company, but often clashed with his boss over his drinking habits. Still, Emeka had agreed to give Grace a chance. The drive to Emeka's house was a stark contrast to the streets Daniel called home. As they entered the gated neighborhood, Grace's eyes widened at the sight of the large houses, manicured lawns, and gleaming cars parked in front of driveways. It was a different world, one she had only seen in movies. Emeka's house was a sprawling two-story building, painted a bright cream color. Daniel led Grace to the front door, where they were greeted by a middle-aged man with a broad smile. "Daniel," Emeka said warmly, shaking his hand before turning to Grace. "And this must be your niece." "Yes, sir," Grace said, bowing her head respectfully. "She's hardworking," Daniel said quickly. "She just needs a chance," Emeka nodded thoughtfully. "We need someone to help around the house. My wife has been complaining about the workload. Let's give her a try." Grace started work that same day. Her duties included cleaning, cooking, and running small errands. Emeka treated her kindly, but his wife, Mrs. Kemi, was a different story. From the moment Grace stepped into the house, Kemi's sharp eyes followed her every move. "She's too young," Kemi muttered to Emeka when she thought Grace wasn't listening. "What if she's lazy? Or worse, a thief?" Grace tried her best to stay out of Kemi's way, focusing on her tasks with quiet determination. She scrubbed floors until her fingers were raw, cooked meals to perfection, and worked late into the night without complaint. Yet no matter how hard she tried, Kemi found fault in everything she did. "You call this clean?" Kemi snapped one afternoon, pointing at a corner of the dining room where a faint speck of dust lingered. "Do it again, and this time do it properly." "Yes, ma'am," Grace said softly, her hands trembling as she picked up the mop. The nights were even harder. Grace was given a small mattress to sleep on in the corner of the laundry room, a cold and cramped space that made her long for the comfort of her parents' home. As the days turned into weeks, her body grew tired, but her spirit refused to break. Then came the accusation. One evening, Kemi stormed into the laundry room, clutching a gold bracelet in her hand. "Where is it?" she demanded, her voice sharp and accusing. Grace blinked, confused. "Ma'am, my other bracelet, the one that matches this. It's gone. You must have taken it." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. "I didn't take anything, ma'am, I swear." Kemi's face twisted with anger. "Don't lie to me. You think I don't know your type? You come from the village with nothing, and now you think you can steal from me." Despite her protests, Kemi wouldn't listen. By the time Emeka came home, Kemi had already made up her mind. "She has to go," she declared. "I won't have a thief under my roof." Emeka looked at Grace with sympathy, but didn't argue with his wife. "I'm sorry, Grace," he said quietly. "It's best if you leave." That night, Grace returned to Daniel's apartment, her belongings packed into a small bag. She sat silently on the couch, her hands clenched into fists as tears streamed down her face. Daniel shook his head in frustration. "I told you, Grace, Lagos isn't for everyone. If you lose another job, you'll have to go back to the village." Grace said nothing, her heart heavy with disappointment. But deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. She had come to Lagos for a fresh start, and she wasn't ready to let it slip away. Grace spent the next few days in Uncle Daniel's apartment, struggling to hold on to hope. The weight of Kemi's false accusation and Daniel's thinly veiled frustration felt unbearable. She wondered if she had made a mistake coming to Lagos, but the thought of returning to the village filled her with dread. She couldn't go back, not to the gossiping villagers or the cold indifference of Aunt Ngozi. One afternoon, as Daniel leaned against the wall, puffing on a cigarette, he finally broke the silence. "I made a few calls," he muttered, exhaling smoke. "There's someone who might take you on. But this is your last chance, Grace. If you mess this up, I'm sending you back to the village." Grace nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I won't mess it up, Uncle." Later that day, Daniel took Grace to meet Mr. Jide, a middle-aged man who owned a small electronics store in the busy streets of Ikeja. The shop was cramped but bustling with customers, its shelves lined with radios, televisions, and mobile phone accessories. Jide was a stout man with a toothy smile, dressed in a neatly pressed shirt and trousers. He greeted Daniel warmly, slapping him on the back before turning to Grace. "So this is the girl?" Jide said, his sharp eyes scanning her from head to toe. Grace shifted uncomfortably under his gaze but managed a polite nod. "She's hardworking," Daniel said quickly. "Just needs a chance," Jide scratched his chin, considering. "Well, I could use someone to help clean the shop and handle small tasks." "Let's see how she does." Grace started work the next morning. Her duties were straightforward, sweeping the shop floor, dusting the shelves, and assisting customers with minor inquiries. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. Jide seemed kind enough, and though the work was tiring, it wasn't unbearable. She was determined to prove herself. Days turned into weeks, and Grace began to settle into her new routine. She learned to navigate the busy streets of Ikeja, picking up supplies for the shop and running errands for Jide. He often praised her for her efficiency, and Grace began to feel a sense of pride in her work. But things began to change. At first, it was small gestures, a lingering hand on her shoulder, a comment about how pretty she looked in her simple dresses. Grace brushed it off, telling herself Jide was just being friendly. But his behavior grew bolder. He began calling her into the back room unnecessarily, standing too close when they spoke. One evening, as she was restocking the shelves, Jide approached her. The shop was empty, and the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. "You've been doing a good job, Grace," he said, his voice low. "You deserve a little reward." Grace stiffened as he reached into his pocket and pulled out a crisp 1,000 naira note. He held it out to her, his eyes glinting with something she couldn't quite place. "I don't need extra money, sir," she said quickly, stepping back. Jide chuckled, his smile widening. "Don't be shy, you work hard. I just want to show my appreciation." Before she could respond, he moved closer, his hand brushing against her arm. "You're a beautiful girl, Grace. You don't need to waste your time working so hard. There are other ways to make a living." Grace's heart pounded in her chest. She backed away, her voice trembling. "Please, sir, I just want to do my job." Jade's expression darkened. "Don't act like you're better than this," he snapped, his tone sharp. "I'm trying to help you." Without another word, Grace grabbed her bag and ran out of the shop, her legs shaking. She didn't stop until she reached Daniel's apartment, tears streaming down her face. That evening, she told Daniel everything. His reaction was a mix of anger and frustration, not at Jade but at Grace. "Why didn't you just ignore him?" Daniel said, pacing the room. "You need this job, Grace. You can't keep running away." "I didn't do anything wrong," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stay." Daniel sighed heavily and sat down, running a hand over his face. "You're making my life difficult," he muttered. "If you lose another job, I'm sending you back to the village." "No arguments," Grace nodded silently, her heart sinking. She felt trapped, her dreams of a fresh start slipping further away. But deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. She had to keep trying, no matter how many obstacles stood in her way. The next morning, Daniel announced that he had found yet another opportunity for her. This time, it was with Madame Bola, the owner of a bustling restaurant and bar in Yaba. "She's strict, but she pays well," Daniel said. "Do your best, Grace. This is your last chance." Grace took a deep breath, steeling herself. "I'll do my best," she said, determination flickering in her eyes. As they set out for Madame Bola's restaurant, Grace couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up her spine. But she forced herself to focus on the one thing that kept her going, the hope that someday her struggles would lead her to a better life. The bustling streets of Yaba were alive with noise and motion as Grace followed Uncle Daniel to Madame Bola's restaurant and bar, her stomach twisting with unease. The building stood on a busy corner, its faded sign barely legible. Loud chatter and laughter spilled out from the open doors, mingling with the heavy aroma of fried food and alcohol. The environment felt chaotic and overwhelming, but Grace forced herself to focus. This was her last chance, and she couldn't afford to fail. Madame Bola was a large, imposing woman with a booming voice and sharp eyes that seemed to pierce right through Grace. She wore a bright patterned Ankara gown and an air of authority that filled the room. "So this is the girl," Bola said, sizing Grace up as she wiped her hands on her apron. "Yes, ma," Daniel replied quickly. "She's hardworking and obedient," Bola grunted. "We'll see about that." "Listen, girl," she said, turning to Grace. "This isn't a charity. You work hard, you get paid. You slack off, you're out. Understood?" "Yes, ma," Grace murmured, lowering her gaze. Grace's duties at the bar were relentless. She cleaned tables, served customers, and helped in the kitchen, often working late into the night. The customers were loud and rowdy, and the kitchen staff barked orders at her constantly. Despite the challenges, Grace threw herself into the work, determined to prove she could handle it. At first, Madame Bola seemed impressed by her dedication. "You're quiet, but you work fast," Bola said one evening as she watched Grace mop the floors. "That's good, keep it up." But as the weeks went by, Grace began to notice the darker side of the bar. Many of the other young women who worked there seemed uneasy, their eyes darting nervously whenever Bola was near. Grace overheard whispered conversations about entertaining certain customers in the private lounge upstairs. She didn't fully understand what they meant, but the fear in their voices made her wary. One evening, as Grace was clearing tables, Madame Bola called her into the back office. The room was cramped and cluttered, with stacks of papers and bottles of alcohol scattered across the desk. Bola sat behind the desk, her sharp eyes fixed on Grace. "You've been working hard," Bola began, her voice unusually smooth. "But if you want to make real money, you'll need to do more than just clean tables." Grace frowned, unsure of what she meant. "Ma," Bola leaned forward, her tone firm. "Some of my customers like company. You're a pretty girl, Grace. You could make good money if you learned to entertain them." The words hit Grace like a slap. Her heart pounded as she realized what Bola was suggesting. She took a step back, shaking her head. "No, ma, I can't do that." Bola's expression hardened. "Don't be foolish, girl. Do you think you can survive in this city with just cleaning jobs? This is how things work here. You do what you're told or you don't get paid." Tears stung Grace's eyes, but she stood her ground. "I won't do it," she said firmly, her voice trembling. Bola's lips tightened into a thin line. "Suit yourself," she snapped. "But don't think you'll last long with that attitude." The next few days were hell. Bola began assigning Grace the hardest tasks, piling more work onto her shoulders and berating her at every opportunity. The other workers avoided her, afraid to be associated with someone who had defied Madame Bola. Despite the pressure, Grace refused to give in. Each night as she lay on the thin mattress in the storage room, she prayed for strength. She clung to the hope that her struggles would eventually lead her to a better life. One fateful night, Bola's anger reached its peak. A particularly rowdy group of customers had demanded to see Grace, and when she refused to join them, Bola exploded. "You're useless," she screamed, throwing a glass against the wall. "Get out of my bar! You're done here!" Grace barely had time to gather her belongings before she was shoved out into the street. The noise and chaos of Lagos enveloped her, but for the first time she felt truly alone. She had nowhere to go and no one to turn to. When she returned to Daniel's apartment, his frustration was palpable. "This is it, Grace," he said coldly, shaking his head. "I told you if you lost another job, you were going back to the village." "I couldn't stay there," Grace said softly, tears streaming down her face. "She wanted me to do things I couldn't do." Daniel sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know what to do with you anymore. Maybe the village is where you belong." Grace said nothing, her chest tight with despair. She felt like a failure, but deep down, she knew she couldn't give up. Lagos had been cruel, but she still believed there was a place for her here. The next morning, as Daniel prepared to take her to the bus station, Grace made a decision. She packed her few belongings and slipped out of the apartment before dawn, determined to find her own way in the city. She had no plan, no money, and no idea where she was going. But she couldn't go back, not to the village, not to the bar, not to any of the places that had tried to break her. She walked the streets of Lagos as the city began to wake, her heart pounding with fear and resolve. Somewhere in this vast, unforgiving city, there had to be a chance for a better life, and she was determined to find it. The city of Lagos had never felt so overwhelming to Grace. As she wandered through the crowded streets, clutching her small bag tightly, the towering buildings and endless sea of people made her feel smaller than ever. The noise of honking cars, shouting vendors, and blaring music surrounded her, yet she felt completely alone. She had no money, no home, and no idea where to go. Her feet ached as she walked, the weight of her belongings pulling at her shoulders. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, but she pushed the feeling aside. She couldn't think about food when she didn't even know where she'd sleep that night. Every step felt like a gamble, but she kept moving, refusing to let despair take over. By evening, Grace found herself near a small church. Its doors were slightly ajar, and the soft sound of singing floated out into the street. Exhausted and desperate, she hesitated before stepping inside. The simple interior of the church offered a stark contrast to the chaos outside. Rows of wooden pews lined the room, and a few people sat scattered throughout, their heads bowed in prayer. A man at the front of the church noticed her. He was tall and lean, dressed in a plain white shirt and black trousers. His kind eyes and warm smile put her at ease. He approached her slowly, his voice gentle. "You look tired, my dear. Are you all right?" Grace hesitated, unsure of what to say. Her lips trembled as she tried to form words, but the overwhelming weight of the day caught up to her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she shook her head. I don't know where to go," she whispered. The man nodded, his expression softening. "Come, sit down," he said, guiding her to a nearby pew. "I'm Pastor Timothy, and this church is open to anyone who needs it. You're safe here." Over the next few hours, Grace poured out her story to Pastor Timothy, her voice shaky but steady as she recounted the challenges she had faced since leaving her village. The pastor listened intently, nodding occasionally but never interrupting. When she finished, he placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You've been through so much, but you're still standing," he said. "That tells me you're stronger than you think." and you're not alone anymore. We'll figure something out." He led her to a small guest room at the back of the church. It was modest, with a single bed, a table and a chair, but to Grace it felt like a sanctuary. For the first time in weeks, she slept soundly, the weight of her struggles momentarily lifted. The next morning, Pastor Timothy introduced Grace to Sister Esther, a kind woman who helped run the church's community programs. Esther listened to Grace's story and immediately offered to help her find work. "There's a vocational center nearby," she said. "They teach tailoring and other skills. It's not much, but it's a start." Grace felt a flicker of hope. "Thank you," she said softly. "I'll do anything." With the church's support, Grace began attending the vocational center, learning how to sew and mend clothes. The work was difficult at first, but she threw herself into it, determined to succeed. The small stipend she received from helping out at the church allowed her to buy food and basic necessities, and she slowly began to rebuild her life. Despite her progress, the shadows of her past lingered. Memories of the humiliation and mistreatment she had endured haunted her, and she often found herself doubting her worth. But Pastor Timothy and Sister Esther refused to let her give up. They reminded her of her resilience, encouraging her to keep moving forward. One Sunday after service, Pastor Timothy approached Grace with a smile. "You've been with us for a while now," he said. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" Grace hesitated, unsure of how to answer. "I just want to live a good life," she said quietly. "I don't want to be a burden to anyone." "You're not a burden," Timothy said firmly. "You've been a blessing to this church and this community, and I believe God has great plans for you." His words filled Grace with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She began to dream again, imagining a future where she could stand on her own 2 feet and help others who had faced the same struggles. But her journey was far from over. One evening, as Grace walked back to the church from the vocational center, she noticed a man following her. At first she thought it was a coincidence, but when she quickened her pace, so did he. Fear gripped her as she realized he wasn't just following her, he was watching her. When she reached the church gates, she turned to confront him, her voice trembling. "Why are you following me?" The man smirked, his eyes cold. "Madam Bowler doesn't forget," he said. "She sent me to find you. You owe her, and she wants what's hers." Grace's heart pounded as she backed away. "I don't owe her anything," she said, her voice firm despite her fear. The man stepped closer, his tone menacing. "You think you can just walk away from her? Lagos isn't that kind of place, girl." Before Grace could respond, Pastor Timothy appeared at the gate. His presence was commanding, and the man quickly retreated, muttering curses under his breath. Timothy watched him go before turning to Grace. "Are you all right?" Grace nodded shakily, but deep down she knew this wasn't over. Madam Bola's influence was far-reaching, and Grace would have to be stronger than ever to protect the life she was building. She clenched her fists, determination lighting her eyes. She had come too far to give up now. Grace spent the next few days on edge, her mind replaying the encounter with Madam Bola's messenger. Though Pastor Timothy assured her she was safe, Grace couldn't shake the fear that lingered like a shadow over her every move. But despite her unease, she refused to let it derail the progress she had made. Each day she walked to the vocational center, her head held high, determined to prove that she could rise above the challenges thrown her way. At the center, Grace's dedication didn't go unnoticed. Her instructor, Mrs. Ifioma, a patient and encouraging woman, often praised her work. "Grace, your stitching is beautiful," she said one afternoon as she examined a dress Grace had made. "You have a gift for this. With time, you could make a real business out of it." The words filled Grace with pride. For the first time in years, she felt a spark of hope, a belief that she could create a life for herself through her own efforts. She began to dream of opening a small tailoring shop, imagining rows of colorful fabrics and satisfied customers leaving with smiles on their faces. One evening, as she returned to the church after another long day at the center, Grace noticed Pastor Timothy and Sister Esther waiting for her at the gate. Their faces were grave and her heart sank. "What's wrong?" she asked, her voice trembling. Timothy sighed. "That man who came the other night, he returned today while you were out." Grace's stomach twisted. "What did he say?" He left a message, Esther said, her tone steady but concerned. He said Madame Bola isn't done with you. She wants you back and she'll do whatever it takes to make you pay for disrespecting her. Grace felt a chill run down her spine. She clenched her fists, fighting back tears. I didn't do anything wrong, she said firmly. I won't go back to her. Timothy placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. You don't have to. This church is your home now and will protect you. But Grace knew that staying at the church forever wasn't a solution. She needed to find a way to cut ties with Madame Bola once and for all. That night, as she lay in bed, she thought about her options. She couldn't confront Bola directly. Her influence was too strong, and Grace had no power to fight her. But perhaps there was another way. The next morning, Grace confided in Mrs. Ifioma at the vocational center. Madame Bola is after me, she explained, her voice trembling. She says I owe her, but I don't know what to do. Mrs. Ifioma listened carefully, her brow furrowed. After a moment, she said, there are people in this city who can help. You don't have to face her alone. Grace looked at her confused. What do you mean? Community leaders, social workers, even the police, Ifioma said. Madame Bola preys on vulnerable girls, but she's not untouchable. If enough people stand up to her, she'll back down. Grace hesitated. The idea of involving authorities felt intimidating, but she couldn't deny that it made sense. With Mrs. Ifioma's encouragement, she agreed to meet with a local women's advocacy group that worked with victims of exploitation. The meeting was a turning point. The women listened to Grace's story with compassion, assuring her that she wasn't alone. They offered her legal support and began gathering evidence against Madame Bola's illegal activities. For the first time, Grace felt like she had allies, people who believed in her and were willing to fight alongside her. As word spread about the investigation, Madame Bola's tactics grew bolder. She sent more men to the church, but each time, Pastor Timothy and the community stood firm, refusing to let them intimidate Grace. The church became a safe haven not just for Grace, but for other girls who had suffered at Bola's hands. One evening, as Grace sat in the church hall stitching a dress, Timothy approached her with a warm smile. You've come a long way, Grace, he said. You've shown more courage than many adults I know. Grace looked up at him, her eyes shining with gratitude. I couldn't have done it without you, Pastor. Nonsense, Timothy said with a chuckle. The strength was always in you. You just needed a little push. Weeks turned into months and Grace's life began to take shape. She completed her training at the vocational center and started taking small tailoring jobs from members of the church. Each stitch she sewed felt like a step toward independence, a way to reclaim her life from the darkness of her past. Madame Bola, meanwhile, began to feel the heat of the investigation. Several of her former employees came forward with testimonies, and the advocacy group worked tirelessly to ensure that justice was served. One day, news spread that Bola had been arrested and her bar shut down. Grace felt a wave of relief, knowing that the chapter of her life dominated by fear and exploitation was finally over. As Grace stood in the church courtyard that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and gold, she allowed herself a rare moment of peace. Her journey had been fraught with trials, but she had survived them all. And now, for the first time in years, she felt truly free. She clasped her hands together, a small smile playing on her lips. This wasn't the end of her story, it was only the beginning. With Madame Bola's arrest and the shadows of her past fading, Grace began focusing on her future. The skills she had gained from the vocational center became her lifeline. Armed with her sewing machine, a gift from the advocacy group, and the growing support of the church community, Grace started taking on more tailoring work. What began as small mending jobs quickly turned into a steady stream of orders for dresses, uniforms, and even bespoke designs. Her days were filled with work. From sunrise to sunset, Grace sat at her sewing machine, her hands moving skillfully as she pieced together fabrics. The church hall, which had once been a place of refuge, became her workshop. With every stitch, she felt a sense of purpose that she had never known before. For the first time in years, Grace began to dream again. One afternoon, Pastor Timothy approached her while she worked. He carried a small envelope in his hand and a smile on his face. Grace, he said, I have some good news. Grace looked up from her sewing, curiosity lighting her eyes. What is it, Pastor? Timothy handed her the envelope. There's a local entrepreneur, Mr. Adwale, who heard about your story from Sister Esther. He owns a fabric store in the city and wants to sponsor your tailoring business. He's offering you a shop space at a discount. Grace's hands trembled as she opened the envelope and read the letter inside. It was true, Mr. Adwale had not only offered her a shop space but also promised to provide her with an initial supply of fabrics on credit. Tears filled her eyes as she looked up at Timothy. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Timothy said with a chuckle. You've earned this, Grace. Your hard work and determination brought you here. Over the next few weeks, Grace worked tirelessly to set up her shop. With help from the church community, she cleaned and painted the small space, transforming it into a vibrant and welcoming storefront. She named it Graceful Stitches, a tribute to her journey and the resilience that had carried her through her darkest days. The shop quickly gained attention. Customers from the neighborhood and beyond came to have their clothes tailored, drawn by Grace's skill and reputation for quality work. Each satisfied customer became a testament to her growth and determination. But Grace's journey wasn't without its challenges. Running a business in Lagos came with its own set of hurdles, rising costs, demanding customers, and the constant pressure to meet deadlines. There were nights when she stayed up until dawn, sewing by the dim light of a lantern. Yet through it all, Grace never lost sight of her purpose. One evening, as she closed the shop, she noticed a familiar figure waiting outside. It was Uncle Daniel, looking older and wearier than she remembered. He held his hat in his hands, his posture hesitant. Uncle, Grace said, surprised. What are you doing here? Daniel shifted uncomfortably. I heard about your shop, he said, his voice low. I wanted to see it for myself. Grace gestured for him to come inside. As he stepped into the brightly lit space, his eyes widened with admiration. You've done well for yourself, Grace, he said. I didn't think you'd make it. There was no bitterness in his voice, only regret. Grace smiled softly. I had a lot of help, she said, and I've learned that it's okay to ask for it. Daniel looked down at his hands. I'm sorry, he said after a long pause, for everything, for not being there for you when you needed me. Grace reached out and touched his arm. You tried, Uncle. That's all that matters. As the weeks turned into months, Grace continued to thrive. She used her growing success to give back to the community, partnering with the vocational center to mentor young girls who, like her, had faced difficult beginnings. Her shop became more than just a business. It became a symbol of hope and resilience for everyone who knew her story. One day, as she stood at her sewing machine, the afternoon sun streaming through the window, Grace reflected on how far she had come. The pain of her past no longer defined her. It had shaped her into the person she was today, a strong, independent woman with a bright future ahead. She smiled as she threaded the needle, ready to create something beautiful. Grace had learned to stitch her life back together, one piece at a time. And now, with every thread, she was weaving a story of hope, strength, and endless possibility. With her shop flourishing, Grace found herself being approached by various organizations and churches to share her story. At first, the idea of speaking in front of crowds terrified her, but Pastor Timothy encouraged her. You've been through so much, Grace, he said. Your story can inspire others to keep fighting, just as you did. Grace eventually agreed, and her first speaking engagement was at a women's empowerment event organized by the advocacy group that had helped her confront Madame Bola. Standing on the stage, her heart pounding, she looked out at the audience, a mix of women, young and old, many of whom carried the same struggles she had once borne. Taking a deep breath, she began to speak. There was a time when I thought my life was over, she said, her voice steady despite her nerves. But I learned that even in the darkest moments, there is always a glimmer of hope. Sometimes it's hard to see, but it's there, waiting for you to reach for it. Her words resonated deeply with the audience. As she spoke about her journey, from losing her parents to enduring mistreatment, to finally finding her strength, tears filled the eyes of many who listened. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. That day, Grace discovered another purpose for her life. Beyond sewing and running her business, she wanted to be a voice of encouragement for others. She began volunteering her time at shelters and community centers, speaking to young girls who faced similar challenges. Her message was simple but powerful. No matter how broken life may seem, there is always a way to rebuild. Years later, Grace stood outside her shop, watching as a group of young apprentices worked diligently inside. The once small tailoring business had grown into a thriving enterprise, with customers coming from across Lagos to have their clothes made by Graceful Stitches. She had even expanded her services to include a training academy, giving others the opportunity to learn the skills that had transformed her life. The church community remained an integral part of her life, and Pastor Timothy continued to be her greatest supporter. On Sundays, she still sang in the choir, her voice now filled with a confidence that reflected the woman she had become. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Grace leaned against the doorway of her shop and smiled. Her journey had been long and filled with trials, but it had also been a testament to the power of resilience and faith. She had not only survived but had thrived, turning her pain into purpose and her struggles into success. And as she looked out at the bustling streets of Lagos, Grace knew that her story was far from over. The future was bright, and she was ready to embrace it with open arms. Her cry for grace had been answered, and she was determined to share that grace with the world. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.